The letter was still warm from his hand when she read it. Not from sentiment, no, nothing so tender as that. Warm because it had been pressed beneath the seal of a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades learning precisely how to destroy her. Warm because the wax bore the crest of Lord Reginald Harwick, Baron of Dunmore, and every drop of that crimson wax had been poured with the cold, deliberate patience of a man who believed himself entirely untouchable. Lady Elara Sinclair stood in the center of the magistrate's courtroom, her spine rigid as marble, her gloved hands folded before her with a composure that cost her everything she possessed. The room smelled of tallow candles and damp wool, and the particular stench of 50 judgmental souls packed into a gallery not large enough for their collective outrage. Whispers coiled through the chamber like smoke, low, insidious, unbearably cruel. She had heard her name spoken in those whispers for 3 weeks now. She supposed she ought to have grown accustomed to the sound of it, used as an insult. She had not. She was 22 years of age, unmarried, and standing trial for theft. Specifically, the alleged theft of private correspondence from the Harwick estate at Glenmore Park on the 14th of October in the year of our Lord 1814. The correspondence in question, a collection of letters purported to contain evidence of her late father's considerable debts and certain indiscretions, had vanished from Lord Harwick's private library 3 nights prior to her arrest, and Harwick, that serpent in a velvet waistcoat, had not hesitated for a single breath before pointing his manicured finger directly at her. Before we continue this story, and I promise you, this tale is only just beginning to burn, if you are new to the Duke's lost letters, welcome, darling listener. You have found your home. Please take a moment to like this story and subscribe to the channel. Every like, every subscription tells me that you wish for more candlelight, more scandal, more dukes behaving in the most devastatingly romantic ways imaginable. It costs you nothing and means absolutely everything. Now, back to our courtroom. Elara had not stolen those letters. She had recovered them. There is a distinction, she had told herself, in the cold grey hours before dawn in her cell at the magistrate's house, a distinction that ought to matter enormously to a court of law. Her father, Colonel Edmund Sinclair, deceased these 4 years past, had written those letters in a moment of financial desperation to Lord Harwick, letters that revealed not wickedness, but weakness, the weakness of a man who had borrowed money he could not repay, who had made promises he had not kept, and who had, in a single moment of poor judgment, put his signature beneath words that Harwick had spent 4 years weaponizing against the Sinclair family, like a blade held perpetually at their throats. Elara had gone to Glenmore Park. She had entered through the library window, the October air sharp and frost-tinged against her cheeks. She had found the letters locked in a rosewood casket on the 2nd shelf, precisely where her father's old manservant had told her they would be. She had taken them, she had run, and she had been caught. Not at the window, not in the act itself. She had been caught because someone at Glenmore Park had seen her. Someone had carried that information directly to Harwick, and Harwick, that serpent in a velvet waistcoat, had not hesitated for a single breath before pointing his manicured finger directly at her. Because the letters were not the point. The letters had never been the point. The point was this: Lord Reginald Harwick had wished to marry Elara Sinclair. He had made his intentions known 3 months prior at the Pemberton Autumn Assembly, a proposal delivered not with tenderness, not with warmth, but with the particular flavor of condescension that men of his sort mistook for flattery. He had told her she was handsome enough for his purposes. He had told her that marriage to him would settle all of her family's remaining obligations. He had told her with a thin and reptilian smile that she ought to consider herself fortunate. She had declined. And now she stood in his courtroom, for it was his courtroom, she had no illusions, wearing her best grey muslin gown, the one with the cream ribbon at the collar that her mother had pressed with such painful, loving care that very morning, and she told herself she was not afraid. If you are listening and your heart is already racing, as mine is, telling this story, do tap that like button. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the Duke's Lost Letters, this is your sign, your very clear and melodramatic sign from the universe to do so now. We tell stories here that will ruin you beautifully. Subscribe and stay. Now, where were we?
The gallery stirred. A murmur, low and collective, rolled through the chamber like a wave gathering itself before it breaks upon the shore. Elara did not turn her head. She had disciplined herself not to look at the gallery. She knew what she would see there, the familiar faces of Bath society, those powder-soft and pearl-adorned creatures who had danced beside her at assemblies, who had taken her arm on the pump-room promenade, who were presently devouring her ruin with the eager, pitiless appetite of those who believe scandal is something that happens only to other people. She knew also that somewhere in that gallery she had heard it, she had felt it, the particular electricity that preceded his presence wherever he moved, was Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Wycliffe. She had not seen him in 11 months. He had gone to his estates in the north, following the dissolution of their understanding. That was the word she permitted herself, understanding. Not betrothal, because it had never been formalized, not courtship, because to name it such would require her to acknowledge what she had surrendered when she had told him, with far more steadiness than she had felt, that she could not in good conscience bind herself to him while her family's affairs remained so precarious. She had released him. She had done it cleanly, or at least she had attempted to, and she had spent 11 months constructing a very convincing internal portrait of a woman who did not miss him. It was not a convincing portrait. Judge Pemberton, a man of roughly 60 years with the countenance of a particularly displeased bulldog, arranged his papers with the deliberate slowness of a man who understood that the room awaited his authority. He cleared his throat. The chamber fell to silence. Lord Harwick's solicitor stood and began his recitation of the charges in a voice designed to carry not merely to the judge, but to every ear in that gallery, every ear that would subsequently carry these words into parlours and drawing-rooms and morning calls across the whole of Bath society. Elara breathed. She breathed because it was the only act entirely within her own power. It was then, precisely then, in the suspended moment between the last word of the charges and the first word of her required response, that she heard the door. Not the creak of it, not the ordinary sound of a late-coming observer slipping into a pew at the rear of the gallery. No, this was the particular sound of a door opened with decision, with momentum, with the absolute confidence of a man who has never once in his life been required to apologize for taking up space in a room. Boots on the stone floor, even, measured, unhurried. And then his voice. "I beg the court's pardon." It was not loud. It did not need to be. The Duke of Wycliffe possessed the sort of voice that rooms arranged themselves around, low, assured, with an underneath of something that in other circumstances she might have called tenderness, and in this one could only call controlled fury. The judge looked up. The gallery turned. Harwick's solicitor stopped mid-sentence. Elara turned. She had told herself she would not, but she turned. He was exactly as she had not permitted herself to remember him, tall, dark-coated, his jaw set with severity that did nothing to diminish the terrible, inconvenient beauty of his face. His eyes, those grey eyes, the colour of winter sky over the moors, found hers across the length of that courtroom with a precision that suggested he had known precisely where she stood before he had even opened the door. "Your Grace," said Judge Pemberton, his tone suggesting that dukes were a category of disruption he had not previously accounted for in his procedural considerations. "Yes," said the Duke of Wycliffe, walking forward. "I expect it is." He reached the front of the room. He did not look at Harwick. He did not look at the judge, at the gallery, at the solicitor whose papers had scattered in his shock. He looked only at Elara, and his expression was one she had seen only once before, on the night she had released him, and which she had spent 11 months trying to forget. "Your Grace," the judge began, "I have in my possession," and his voice had acquired that particular quiet that is louder than shouting, "the original correspondence between Colonel Sinclair and Lord Harwick, dating from the autumn of 1810, correspondence that Lord Harwick represented to this court as stolen." He reached inside his coat and produced a sheaf of letters bound with black ribbon. "They were not stolen. They were delivered to me directly by a former steward of Glenmore Park, a man by the name of Tobias Marsh, who witnessed their fraudulent use and whose sworn testimony I also possess." He placed the letters on the judge's bench with a composure that made Harwick's face drain to the color of old parchment. "Furthermore, I can demonstrate that Lord Harwick's accusation against Lady Sinclair was made not in the interest of justice, but in the interest of personal coercion. He sought to compel a woman of impeccable character into a marriage she had wisely and rightfully refused."
The gallery erupted. Harwick was on his feet. She could hear him, the splatter of his outrage, the bark of his objection. But it was all very far away suddenly, all very distant, because Edmund had turned from the judge and was looking at her again, and the composure she had maintained for 3 weeks through arrest and humiliation and 23 nights of lying awake in the dark cataloguing every irreversible decision she had ever made, that composure cracked. Not entirely, but enough. "Edmund," she said, and it was barely a whisper. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. "I should have come sooner," he said, very quietly, for her alone. "I should have come the moment I heard. Forgive me." "You came," she managed. "I will always come," he said. "I rather thought you understood that." And then, before the judge could raise his gavel, before the gallery could draw its collective breath, before Harwick could form a single syllable of protest, the Duke of Wycliffe, Edmund Ashford, one of the most powerful peers in all of England, took Lady Elara Sinclair's face in his hands and kissed her, in the middle of the courtroom, in front of everyone. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. Judge Pemberton roared, his bulldog countenance having achieved an entirely new altitude of displeasure. The gallery did not achieve order. The gallery, it must be said, lost its collective mind entirely. 3 ladies in the second row required their smelling salts. One gentleman knocked his hat from the bench in his excitement and did not retrieve it. The court reporter's quill ceased its scratching for the first time in living memory, and Lord Harwick, Baron of Dunmore, stood rigid as a post, watching the spectacular collapse of every calculation he had ever made regarding Elara Sinclair, and felt the cold and particular weight of a man who has overreached himself catastrophically. When Edmund finally drew back, unhurried, utterly unrepentant, his grey eyes warm with something that had never really been extinguished, Elara found that she was, in fact, smiling. She hadn't known she still possessed the capacity for it. She was glad to discover she did. "This," she said softly, "is extremely improper." "Entirely," he agreed. "The judge is still shouting." "Let him shout." She laughed, a small, incredulous sound, swallowed quickly. "Edmund, you have caused the most extraordinary scandal." He looked at her with those winter-grey eyes and said simply, "You are worth every syllable of it."
The charges against Lady Elara Sinclair were dismissed before the close of that afternoon's session. Lord Harwick's solicitor withdrew the case with the haste of a man who has abruptly grasped the shape of the disaster he is standing inside. Harwick himself departed the courtroom without a word, a silence that, in Bath, speaks louder than any sentence ever passed. Edmund Ashford, Duke of Wycliffe, offered his arm to Lady Elara Sinclair as they descended the courtroom steps into the pale November sunlight. She took it. She had, she decided, been releasing him for long enough. He proposed properly that evening in the drawing-room of her mother's house, on one knee, with the particular earnestness of a man who has learned what it costs to let go of something irreplaceable. She accepted with considerably less steadiness than she had managed in declining Harwick's proposition, which is to say that she was weeping rather thoroughly by the third word of his speech, and that Edmund bore this with extraordinary tenderness and only a very small amount of gentlemanly alarm. They were married in the spring. The letters, her father's letters, were burnt in the library grate on the evening of their engagement. Edmund held them to the flame himself. Neither of them watched them go. There was, by then, rather more interesting things to look at. And somewhere across Bath, Lord Harwick received a very brief, very cordial note from the Duchess of Wycliffe, for she was that now, the Duchess, and the title sat upon her with the ease of something long deserved, which said only, "I trust, my lord, that we understand one another." He did not reply. He understood perfectly. And that, my darling listeners, is where we leave them. Edmund and Elara, scandal and sunlight, the most magnificent courtroom kiss in the history of Regency England. If this story found its way to your heart, please leave it a like. It truly does make all the difference to this channel and to me. And if you have not yet subscribed to The Duke's Lost Letters, I am asking you now, with all the dramatic sincerity I possess, subscribe, ring that bell, come back for every story, every scandal, every duke who does something absolutely unhinged in the name of love. Until next time, may your letters always find their way home.